speak first, followed by Andrew.
Thank you, Professor Olson. If I had known there might be thousands of people on Zoom, it's quite likely I might have done more with interior decorating, as you can see behind me. So please forgive me coming at you from a room which is used solely for work. And as you can tell behind me, things are organized according to stacks. So on that hopefully somewhat entertaining note, start off here with this talk, Changing Interpretations of Iowa History, the 175th anniversary of Iowa. The state of Iowa has been badly neglected by historians in recent decades. The state is viewed as a flat and homogeneous Midwestern place full of white people. Unfortunately, Iowa's dull reputation has not encouraged the study of the state. It has not attracted much attention from historians because it's regarded as a state without much to study. It lacks big, diverse cities and is seen as a static provincial backwater. Issues that have dominated the historical profession since the late 20th century, things like race, class, and gender, don't seem terribly important in a place where supposedly it's made up of middle-class white people. Iowa is one of the whitest states in the country. It might be number 6 in terms of whitest states, along with places like Vermont and New Hampshire. Even the state government struggles with the widespread belief that Iowa is a boring place where nothing of interest has ever occurred. Governor Kim Reynolds declared that March 2021 was Iowa History Month. She wore a shirt that said, "Iowa, history happens here." An optimistic slogan, which ironically highlights the lack that much of the country sees Iowa as just flyover country, where not much of importance happens. This mythology is hard to refute, despite the best efforts of the governor. Historians, social scientists, journalists, and others should pay more attention to the place, as the state has many unknown stories that are worth telling. Iowa was never a homogeneous place. It has always been more complex than realized. Its history full of struggle and contest, its story an untidy and messy one. It may not be racially diverse, but it has great religious diversity. Iowa also has a relatively progressive record on race and gender issues. Iowa's early historians were white men who told the story about white men for a population of almost entirely white people. Women were mostly left out, barely receiving any attention in a 1952 multi-volume state history. Iowa did not have a good state history until Dorothy Schroeder published her history of the state, Iowa, the Middle Land, in 1996. Before her, Iowa historians mostly discussed wars, politics, frontier settlement, and railroads. Since the 1960s and 1970s, historians have focused their energy on stories of those who've been left out of the historical record. Women, Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos and Latinas, Asian Americans, as well as other marginalized groups such as the poor and the working class. Historians of Iowa have also shifted their attention to those who have been ignored, greatly broadening our understanding of the state and writing a more inclusive history that incorporates the poor, minority groups, and women. The first major history of the state was written by Benjamin F. Gue and published in 1903. He titled it History of Iowa from Earliest Times to the Beginning of the 20th Century. It had 4 volumes and focused upon the experiences of white men in politics, as well as frontier settlement and the Civil War. The last 2 topics were subjects of 2 volumes of the 4. Gue was a participant in the 19th century history of Iowa, helping to organize Iowa's Republican Party in 1856, serving in the state legislature, editing several newspapers, and serving as lieutenant governor of the state. The next important history of Iowa was written in 1920. Cyrenus Cole wrote the one-volume history, A History of the People of Iowa, emphasizing the frontier experience, the Civil War, politics, and railroads, much like Gu. Cole's book surveyed the state's history until the end of the First World War. His one volume was much shorter than Gu, and it's often more useful for historians today. He's got important sections on the economic effects of the Panic of 1893, social histories of railroads, as well as frontier settlement. If you know anything about Iowa, you may have read something by one of the more prominent historians, a guy by the name of William J. Peterson. He wrote The Story of Iowa, The Progress of an American State. It's a large 2-volume narrative encyclopedia of more than 1,100 words. It includes everything from climate and geology to transportation, education, and religion. Despite being written more than 30 years after Cole's book, The Story of Iowa had little on women or the state's non-white population. It is a much more useful reference for the modern writer because of its encyclopedic-like collection of information. If you want to know how many people lived in Des Moines in 1920, that's the book for you. If you want to know how many Baptist churches there were in Davenport in 1850, that's the book for you. Peterson was superintendent of the State Historical Society for 24 years and history professor at the University of Iowa for almost 40. He was also editor of the Iowa Journal of History and editor of several other books. So his imprint on the state's history is quite large. In the late 20th century, 3 one-volume state histories were published. The first of these was Leland Sage's A History of Iowa, which was mostly focused on politics. It was published in 1974. Sage reviewed settlement, had a bit on the Civil War, reviewed some subjects not covered in earlier histories by Peterson, Gu, or Cole, but it did not break much new ground. It is the go-to book for politics, but it can be a little bit of a slog in some places. A couple years after that, Joseph Fraser Wall published Iowa, A History in 1978. It's a series of topical essays that is pretty easy to read, and it's accessible. I think it's still in print. It's got lots on religion, literature, and some on culture, but it's an incomplete history. It's topical essays. We come to take the land. We fight for the land, things like that. The most important book probably ever published in Iowa history in terms of a state narrative is by Dorothy Schweeder. Her book is called Iowa, the Middle Land, published in 1996 for the state's 150th anniversary. It's a comprehensive history, covers immigration, the Amish, the Amana colonies, far more comprehensive and humane overview of Native people in the state. It is the basic fundamental book for understanding Iowa. It's the go-to place. It's a standard history, and it's been so for a generation and probably will be for a few more years. Schweeder died in 2014, having written, edited, or co-authored 9 books on Iowa history. She's the most important historian of Iowa, even if William Peterson wrote 400 articles on the state, many of which then made their way into his book, The Story of Iowa. Now, the past few decades have seen a change in subjects covered for Iowa. And these are much more different, much more varied, much more inclusive than you have seen us talk about so far. 1980 saw the publication of several important books that greatly enhanced our understanding of the state. Glenda Riley, a professor of history at the University of Northern Iowa for more than 20 years, and an important